I've always loved my job as a landscaper or lawn care specialist. I make my own hours, get to work outdoors, and best of all, I get to embrace my passion. I view lawn care as much more of an art form like architecture, because no two trees, lawns, hedges, or ponds are the same. When you're a landscaper, you basically take the nature equivalent of raw material and craft it into something unique. That's why I view it more like an art form than just cutting the grass. And there is no telling what you may encounter while working. I thought I knew that until my last job. By far the busiest times of year in this line of work are spring and fall. Spring, because after winter the grass and plants are finally starting to bloom and need tons of attention, especially because of the frequent rain, and fall, because it's the final bit of time to keep an eye on things before the months-long cold of winter makes my job irrelevant. I'm usually pretty busy in the summer depending on the weather, because I either have to work hard to make sure grass on lawns doesn't dry out in the heat, or there is no shortage of lawns to mow if it's a rainy summer. But fall also means that in addition to the usual landscaping tasks, there are leaves to rake, which was just fine with me. I've always loved raking leaves, as I find it calming and the vivid colors on the trees give you plenty to look at while you're working. Most of my clients are long-time ones, so much so that we can communicate in what is essentially shorthand. But of all my customers, my favorite land to work belongs to Mr. and Mrs. Allen. They have a large stone house with double doors and blue shutters, and the property is set on 7 acres with a solid blend of all kinds of trees. Lots of pine trees and plenty of beautiful maple and other trees that shed their leaves come fall. And I was due there for a job on a lovely October afternoon. It was a short drive there, and on the way, I passed numerous storefronts with orange lights or cobwebs in the windows before I arrived at the Allens neighborhood. It's filled with people who are actually pretty cool and friendly. That's one reason the neighborhood is one of the most prized places to go trick-or-treating around here. All the houses are spaced pretty close together. There's plenty of sidewalk, and the homeowners get really into the holiday spirit. All down the street were houses decorated in their own unique ways. One was covered with cobwebs and a giant spider, while others were filled with a cemetery, an open coffin, and a collection of monsters. Mr. and Mrs. Allen kept it simple with plenty of orange lights, pumpkins, and some dried corn stalks arranged around the garage. Once I parked in the driveway, I got out of my truck, got everything ready, and got started on my job. First, I mowed the front lawn. There is nothing like the smell of freshly cut grass on a refreshing fall morning, and when that was done, it was time for me to take care of the leaves. It was early October, and the trees in the backyard were only beginning to shed their leaves. So raking them all out from under the trees where the mower couldn't get them only took about half an hour, and all of them could fit into a small pile. The Allens always liked me to mulch their leaves, which works for me. So I got the mower ready and methodically went about turning the leaves in the backyard into tiny piles that wouldn't cover the grass. When I was done, the smell of leaves coated the air. Also on the schedule today was for me to plant some mums, which was always a big request for me once fall arrived. When that was all said and done, I went home and had a grilled cheese sandwich and some soup for lunch. Several days later, I had an appointment with the Sullivan family, who lived next door to the Allens. So I went right on schedule and took care of their lawn. They generally had less trees in their backyard than the Allen house, but they were bigger, and their leaves were generally falling at a faster rate. There was a bit of fog that morning that hung thickly in the air, and when I arrived, I could see the grass and the leaves scattered on it were soaked with dew. The Sullivans liked me to use a leaf blower and bag up their leaves, so that task quickly took up 2 hours. As I worked, I could see the one tree that was technically on the Allen property, but would occasionally drop leaves on the Sullivan property. Thankfully, it wasn't a big deal. The two families got along great and had been friendly for decades. I've met far too many families where a leaf falling on their property from a tree that wasn't theirs was a huge problem. Farther down in the yard, Mr. Sullivan was reading a book by his fire ring, which had a fire lit in it and was crackling along in the gentle breeze. The smell from it casually billowed my way and made the fall air with the crisp breeze and earthy smell of leaves that much more invigorating. Definitely a pleasant atmosphere to finish my work in. The next day was one of those rainy October days where you can feel that fall has arrived. It was gray and rainy all day, and everywhere I drove you could see evidence that the steady rain had caused numerous trees everywhere to shed leaves that had thus far managed to stay on the branches. Although I spent the day indoors watching scary movie marathons, I was mentally gearing up for the inevitable post-rainstorm calls that would arrive as soon as things dried up. Sure enough, the very next day the calls came in to repair one thing or another, and out I went to tidy things up. No matter how old I get, it never ceases to amaze me the difference just a few days can make for how fall can look and feel. The color creeping into the trees was much more noticeable, with a particularly vivid red making itself known on a tree in the Allen yard that I could spot when I drove past it. Later that week, there was a nasty storm with intense rain and wind that caused numerous trees to fall, which meant I was constantly being called out to help get rid of tree limbs that had been snapped off in the wind, or help cut up trees that had broken in half or been uprooted. One of the many trees damaged from wind was one of the massive ones in the Sullivan's yard. Once I arrived, I took out the necessary equipment and carefully went to work on the fallen tree limb. It was a massive branch, but steadily, the fallen limb became a pile of firewood as I worked under the bright blue sky. I worked until the sun started to dip behind the orange and red foliage. As I finished up, the sun was slowly descending, and the mellow autumn light was peeking out from the gaps in the trees, a sight I never get tired of. I had just finished up with one section and was heading to the other side of the yard to get the last bit of tree that had fallen. The final bit of fallen tree was right in the middle of the yard, where the surface was flat. As I stepped on it, I could tell how soft and wet the ground still was. But as I took another step, I felt something snap, and before I knew what was happening, I was falling through the earth. Moments later, pain shot through my body as I landed on rocky ground. I waited for a moment before getting up. Fortunately, I always keep a tool belt filled with tools on me whenever I work, so I quickly removed a flashlight and switched it on. Thankfully, it worked. I checked my phone, which was fine, but there was no service down here. But I was able to shine my flashlight up and see the hole I had fallen through. Thanks to the rain, the soil had thinned out and revealed that right under that section of the Sullivan's yard was the entrance to a tunnel that someone had placed a board over. No doubt all the years of rain and other types of weather had worn it down, so that by the time of the recent heavy rain, it had been ready to crack when I stepped right on it. Oh well, nothing I could do about it now. The Sullivans were out for the evening, which meant I had no reason to stick around and try to get their attention, especially since there was no way for me to climb out the way I'd fallen in. So that meant I had to follow the small tunnel I found myself in. It was big enough for me to stand in, and in reasonably good condition. No signs of a cave-in. I could feel how the chill had soaked into the earth as I kept walking. There was no telling where I was going or what I would find. All I could do to get out was keep going forward. Several minutes later, the tunnel opened into a cavern, and I realized I was in an abandoned mine. The tools and cart left behind were the giveaway. It wasn't exactly a surprise. I've lived in Pennsylvania my whole life, and there are old mines everywhere, and I've been in several of them before. So I wasn't exactly shocked or afraid as I followed it along. After the work on the Sullivan yard and the amount of walking I'd done to get this far, I could feel how my body was soaked with sweat under my jacket. But the air here wasn't as chilly as it was above ground, so that helped cool me down at least somewhat. Eventually, the tunnel I was walking in narrowed a bit, and the intense darkness of the mine began to fade. Then the tunnel got lighter and lighter, until I was facing a small ladder built into the cavern wall that went up, and beyond that, there was light coming from somewhere above. I switched off my flashlight and carefully climbed the old wooden steps, silently hoping they wouldn't give. They held just fine, and when I pulled myself up the last step, I found myself facing a small opening in the rock wall that I could just barely fit through. That was where the light had been coming from. I took a deep breath and carefully stepped through it. As I did, I could smell the fresh air and relief flooded through my body, but that was immediately followed by confusion. On the other side of the opening in the rock wall was a wide stretch of open space that was surrounded by trees. From the outside, the rock wall looked like a small remnant of a quarry built into the earth. But the open space wasn't exactly open because it was filled with RVs. But they were not all of a similar type, like you would expect in a standard storage space. Far from it, as it seemed like every possible model or design was here. Giant RVs and tiny ones. Ones that looked older than I was. Ones that looked brand new. Ones that you could see at any campground. And ones you never saw aside from in old vintage family home movies. I slowly started walking through the rows of vehicles. They seemed to go on forever, and it wasn't long before I had the sensation that I was lost in some kind of endless labyrinth. It was nighttime by now, and my small flashlight was the only source of light. I was walking on cement, which meant that there were no footprints I could follow. But the upside was that I didn't have to worry about leaving them either. As I kept walking on the cement, I remembered that there used to be a factory somewhere around here, and it was demolished years ago. I guess the floor was all that was left. Seeing all the RVs sitting there, silent and abandoned, was downright creepy. Especially because this wasn't some brightly lit warehouse. This was outside in the dark, and the faint light from my flashlight dancing over the various vehicles gathered here made it all the more unnerving. There was something seriously not right about all this. For starters, it wasn't like this was an actual storage space for a business that sold them. I'd heard of graveyards for ships to say nothing of junkyards, but not RVs. And it wasn't like all these RVs were situated in a public space where anyone could come and look. No, these were hidden away in a place people didn't come looking, and I had no doubt it was for a reason. For a fleeting moment, I thought that maybe this was part of some haunted attraction for the Halloween season. But I know all the haunted houses around, and there was nothing like this. Plus, there were no Halloween decorations around, and these giant luxury RVs were not the type to be used in a haunted house. So the only idea left was that something was up here, and it wasn't good. Especially because as I took a closer look at all the RVs assembled here, it was clear that for all their differences, they had something in common. They had all sustained some kind of small damage. One vintage RV had a broken front window, while I saw a smashed-in side door on one of the giant expensive RVs, and the list went on and on. The sight of a windshield on a relatively new one that had been completely destroyed sent a particular chill up my spine. If all these RVs had sustained damage, then the logical thing that should have happened was for them to be repaired and returned. None of the damage I could see made them uninhabitable. As someone who maintains people's property as his job, none of this seemed right. I slowly walked on, trying to get my bearings. The space seemed endless, and I carefully wandered along looking at everything, until I passed an average modern RV that I've seen plenty of my friends use on vacation. As I passed the door, I shined my flashlight, and the beam of light highlighted that something was on the door's window. I paused for a closer look and saw that it looked like a handprint, and it was made by what looked just like blood. The sight made my stomach sick with fear. Now there was no doubt I needed to get out of here, and fast. Almost if on cue, I heard a sound from far off in the distance, and from all the time spent in nature, I could tell it was a car driving on gravel. Ignoring the fear gripping my stomach, I looked at my surroundings. Some of these RVs, superficial dents aside, were beyond well built. So well built that someone stuck inside would not be able to get out easily if the door was blocked. And I had plenty of small landscaping tools still on my belt that I could easily jam a door handle, if I was able to trick whoever was out there inside the RV. So I took a deep breath, switched off my flashlight, and put together a plan. I had several minutes, but not much more. Whoever was out there would most likely go up and down the rows of RVs, looking for anything out of place. Naturally, an open door would signal that something was amiss and should be checked. Once the person driving was well inside the RV, I could slam the door shut and jam it so there would be no getting out. It was as good a plan as any, and I had to act fast. Thankfully, it wasn't hard to decide on an RV. One of the giant expensive luxury vehicles was the way to go. But even in the dim light, The vehicle's interior was beyond impressive when I briefly checked it. No doubt no expense had been spared from the interior's comfort to the basic strength of the vehicle, which included windows, all of which were in perfect condition without a single scratch on them. The RV also had the perfect main door with a metal handle similar to a refrigerator's. If I were to put my small trowel from my belt inside the handle's space when the door was closed, it would jam the door perfectly. And it was the only door in and out of the vehicle. No normal doors to the front or passenger seat. I also was beyond thankful that this RV, like several on display, were built with plenty of space for me to crawl under and wait. So once I had carefully opened the door to lure in whoever was out here with me, I removed the small trowel from my belt and crawled under the middle of the RV as quietly as possible and waited. All those years crawling around bushes and hedges would definitely come in handy now, as I ducked under the bumper and stared up at the RV. I had barely gotten in place when I heard the tires on gravel stop. Then all was quiet while I was alone with my thoughts. The silence in the space was so thick it was unpleasant, and I felt like my heart was thudding painfully loud as I tried to listen. After what felt like an hour, I heard it, the sound of quiet footsteps coming my way. I swallowed thickly as I listened and got ready to act as soon as it was time. The footsteps quietly shuffled around before they arrived at the RV I was hidden under. As the footsteps got closer, I could tell whoever they belonged to was carrying a flashlight as well, as the beam slowly bobbed along to remind me someone was getting closer until the beam was right beside me. I couldn't see who the footsteps belonged to, or make out any details aside from some basic black leather boots. But as they moved one step closer, I could faintly see the figure's outline in the reflection from one of the RV's tire rims, and I could see they were wearing a belt with a large knife on it. My throat clenched as I stared at them from no more than a few feet away. The stranger was painfully close as I laid there and silently willed whoever was out there to just take the few steps inside the RV. And moments later, the adrenaline in my body kicked up a notch as the boots walked the few steps forward into the open RV. I could feel the RV moving slightly under the weight of its new occupant as the stranger climbed aboard, stepped inside, and slowly began to look around. Despite the fear churning in my stomach, I did feel better that the stranger didn't immediately summon a friend of his who had driven here with him when he saw the open RV door. That meant this was the only other person here. So once the figure slowly started walking towards the bathroom and master bedroom in the back of the RV, that was time for me to climb out and spring into action. With my heart pounding harder than ever before in my life, I crept out from under the RV, took the trowel in hand, and gently grabbed the door handle while listening carefully. Whoever was in there had no idea I was out there, as I could feel the weight of footsteps in the back bedroom. So I carefully closed the door, which closed with a quiet click, before I immediately jammed the trowel in the handle and made sure it was stuck. It was. The stranger inside had no idea what happened, but it didn't take whoever was inside long to realize something had happened, because moments later, footsteps were hastily walking towards the door, before there was weight pushing on it from the other side. It didn't give an inch, and some faint relief flooded through my body. I crept quietly away as whoever was trapped inside tried to apply more pressure to the door, and nothing changed. As I put more distance between the RV and myself, I thought I could hear a muffled yell from inside, but that was it. I didn't stop walking, and before long, I had reached the other side of the open space and found myself facing a wall of trees. There was still no sign that whoever was stuck in the RV had managed to make any progress at all. With that hopeful thought, I took several more steps and finally reached the part of the woods that was well on the other side from where I had climbed out of the abandoned mine. When I finally walked through the trees and was lost in them moments later, I finally felt somewhat better. But I kept my flashlight off to avoid being detected, and I carefully crept along, listening carefully for any sound of movement or voices. As I continued along walking in the trees, I heard a second vehicle roaring up from the other side of the area. I immediately ducked behind a tree and turned to watch. Someone had driven into the area via a truck, and the driver wasted no time getting out and racing into the vast collection of RVs their shoes echoing loudly on the hard floor. I had a pretty good idea what would happen next. And I was right, because although I couldn't see anything yet, I could hear the RV door being yanked open before it was slammed shut. Then when both people walked quickly back towards the truck, which still had its headlights on, I could see, and I got a good look at the person who unknowingly walked right past me. He was a tall guy, muscular, and if I had to guess, I'd say mid-30s. His associate fit the same description. "What happened?" one of them asked the other. "I don't know. I went inside to see what made the door open, and before I knew it, it was sealed shut and I couldn't get out. Just like I told you." Well, it was sealed shut with this. I could faintly see him holding up my trowel that was available at any store for a few bucks. And there's no telling who's responsible for it and where they are. We'll just have to take it from here. Right. Then I watched as they both got in the truck and roared out of there in the opposite direction from me. I let out a deep breath before I kept walking. I knew I would eventually reach a road, but every step was tinged with nerves, as I half expected someone lurking behind a tree to reach out and attack me. But after about 2 hours, I managed to reach a road without incident, and when I saw it, I finally had reception to call for help. I immediately told the police what I'd seen, and they dispatched someone to find me while the dispatcher stayed on the line with me. And I'd never been more relieved in my life than when I saw the flashing lights of the police car coming towards me. I described the general direction I had come from, but it didn't take long for the cops to find the place, because after I left, someone had set fire to all the RVs, and before long, everything there was burning intensely, and the smoke was visible for miles. They had to bring in a massive team of firefighters to calm the blaze down, and they were able to get the fire under control in time for the cops to find out that all the RVs that hadn't been totally burned were all listed as missing along with their owners. The cases involved spanned many years and every region of the country. After some time, the cops were able to use some of what was found at the RV collection to aid in solving some missing persons cases. But there was never any lead on who was responsible for it, nor did they ever figure out what the specific motivation was. As for me, I'll always be extra careful where I step while on a landscaping job from now on. The Sullivans felt horrible when they heard what happened and gave me a huge bonus for my work that day. They were even gracious enough to invite me over for when they gave out Halloween candy. Since they stuck to sitting out on the front porch with some hot apple cider, I happily accepted.